Hi everyone, the season has absolutely flown by and we're at the end already, so it's time to go through my 2022 driver performance rankings. Now, these rankings are only based on the driver's performance this season, doesn't take into account any other season. This order isn't how I'd rank the drivers from best to worst, this is only for this season's performance. Now, this ranking also takes into account car performance. It's fairly common to see like normal drivers rankings very similar to the driver standings with the points, but I tried to make it a bit more fairer and give the teams and drivers at the bottom of the championship a bit more consideration when I'm putting together their ranking. Now, although saying that, the driver that finished P20 in the championship, I'm going to start with P20, and it was Nicholas Latifi. Now, he got out-qualified by Albon 18-3, which is really awful, with an average qualifying position of 17.5. In the races, slightly better, one race better, but Albon still beat him 17-4. And that sort of doesn't account for DNFs and things like that, with an average race position of 15.8. Now, Nicholas Latifi is obviously leaving at the end of the season, and I think this is the right decision. Seems like a great guy, lovely character. I've loved having him in the paddock this season and last. But yeah, I just don't think F1's for him. I hope he can find another series. I think IndyCar might be something he can get into. He just hasn't been performing at the level that sort of is expected in Formula 1. And Williams going forward, if they really want to step up, they need a driver that can perform. So yeah, unfortunately for Latifi, he's in last place for me. Now, this might seem a little bit harsh, but I'm putting Mick Schumacher in P19 for me. Finished the overall championship in 16th place. Looking at his quality results, he got beaten by Magnussen 7-14 with an average quality position of 13.6. But he actually beat Magnussen in the races 14-7, so it's the complete opposite, with an average race position of 13.1. Now, this initially seems quite good that he beat Magnussen 14-7 in races, but when you look at the points, Magnussen got over double the points Mick had. Mick only scored points in 2 races, and they were back to back in Silverstone and then Austria, and that's not even considering the amount of damage he's caused in the car. He's caused more damage than any other driver on the grid this season. And with a team like Haas that struggle to meet the cost cap, they need a driver who, I think, first, isn't going to destroy the car, and second, can get some decent points. I think it's a real shame we're not going to see Mick next year, but I think he might get that Mercedes reserve role, and I think we could potentially see him come back maybe in 2024, if not in 2025. I definitely think we'll see him in F1 again. Now, Lance Stroll, for me, is next in P18, finishing the standings in 15th place, and getting beaten by Vettel 7-13 in qualifying. But in the races, they were tied 10 all, with an average quality of 14.2 and an average race of 11.5. I actually think Stroll is slightly improving, but the low rating of 18th in my rankings mostly comes from some of the driving we've seen from Stroll this season. It's been awful. He's nearly crashed into his teammate, nearly put Vettel in a wall in Interlagos. And there's also that awful incident with Alonso down the straight in Kota. It's just not great to see, and I'm really surprised he hasn't been given a race ban. It's going to be really interesting to see how he copes with Alonso as his teammate next season. But I think he's getting slightly quicker. I'm just concerned for just like the safety around him, and yeah, I just feel like he's sort of pushing the limits a little bit with what he can get away with. 17th on my list is, unfortunately, Daniel Ricciardo, finishing the season in 11th. Now, we've just found out that he's going to be the Red Bull third driver, which is great news. I think every F1 fan wants to see him around the paddock next season. But yeah, his spell at McLaren just did not work out whatsoever. Got beat by Lando 19-3 in qualifying, so an absolute landslide, with an average quality position of 11.6, and then in races slightly better. He went 5-17 to Lando with an average finish of 11.4. So yeah, in races he's not even gaining that many positions either. Now, I think this is just a spell to forget about for Ricciardo. He's found a team, he's got Red Bull, he's going to be able to maybe get some drives in that Red Bull, see potentially if he can get into some practice sessions or maybe even a race if Verstappen or Perez are ill. And I think we will see him back in 2024, if not maybe 2025. And I think a lot of people are thinking that he could be replacing Perez if Perez sort of doesn't have the performances that the team expect. 16th for me is Yuki Tsunoda. finishing the championship in 17th. Now, I feel like this AlphaTauri is really hard to judge. He came 9th overall in the championship, which is awful considering that car last year was good enough to be fighting for sort of top 5 most race weekends. In qualifying, he went 8-13 against Gasly, and also 8-13 against Gasly in the races, with an average quality of 12.2 and a race position of 13.1. My opinion on Tsunoda is I think he is fairly lucky that he's got a chance in 2023 at another season. Don't think he's been that great, to be honest, but also he had this rookie season, which is fair enough, and then his second season, this new regulation change, and it's not exactly like Gasly's been setting the world alight either. I think next season we'll really see what he's got. He's coming against Nick de Vries, who's never sort of had a full season in F1, and we know he can win championships in other series. I think next season's going to be make or break for Yuki, but yeah, I wasn't massively impressed. Still quite a few errors more early on in the season. I think Monaco and Canada stand out for me as just sort of silly crashes. Towards the end, I think he sort of finished fairly strong, if I'm honest, and with his qualifying nearly 1 place better than his average race pace, it shows that he probably can put that car into a better position. Just that race pace on that AlphaTauri this season was awful. 15th on my list was Pierre Gasly, finishing 14th in the championship. As I just mentioned, he beat Tsunoda 13-8 and also beat him 13-8 in the races. Now, this one was a bit of a funny one for Gasly. Obviously, last season, he was probably one of the drivers of the season. He was phenomenal. And the season before, he had a race win even. Now, this car has completely fallen off. I don't know what went wrong with it. I don't know if just AlphaTauri just chucked all their sort of development into the Red Bull, not the AlphaTauri. I think this one would be concerning if Gasly was there next season. But the fact he's going over to Alpine, and we know what he can do. He's one of the best qualifiers on the grid and probably up there with one of the top drivers, in my opinion. I think we're going to see his true potential next season. Probably lost a bit of interest. We heard his really frustrating radio messages. Brakes weren't great on that car. Balance wasn't great. And yeah, overall, I just think it was a bit of a tricky season for that AlphaTauri team. So P14 now for me was Zhou. Now he finished 18th and he barely got any points overall, to be honest. But if you actually watch the season and look at some of his stats, he went 8-12 against Bottas in qualifying. Bottas, who's been driving for the Mercedes top team, absolutely dominated over the last season. Obviously not as good as Hamilton, but he's up there. He wouldn't have kept that seat if he wasn't up there sort of at a similar-ish level to Hamilton, and be able to get the sort of second places that he needed for that long time. Zhou coming in on his rookie season, the only rookie on the grid, and going 8-12 against Bottas, I think it's pretty impressive, and his racing was actually really impressed me. I wasn't expecting him to be that competitive in the races. I think the results are massively skewed. If you look at Bottas's points, he scored all of his points. I think he scored over 90% of his points in the first 6 or 7 races. And that was when Zhou was still getting used to the car. So I think it would be extremely harsh to look at the points and say that Zhou's has been awful this season. He obviously had been extremely unlucky with DNFs as well. And he's had some pretty awful crashes, especially that one in Silverstone. So I think Zhou has got a lot of potential, and I'm looking forward to seeing him next season. It's just the Alfa Romeo towards sort of the second half of the season was just nowhere. They just couldn't get points. There was nothing they can get out of it. It was just a bit of a dud car, to be honest. 13th is Valtteri Bottas, finishing in 10th. Now, his first season in that Alfa Romeo, and I think he would say it was fairly successful. As I just mentioned, beating Zhou 12-8 in quali, and then 15-7 in the actual races. Now, I think Alfa Romeo are extremely lucky to have Bottas. I think he's probably one of the best drivers they could have. If you look at his average quali position was 10.5, and his race position was 10.4, it just shows how consistent of a driver he is. He very rarely DNFs, he very rarely gets into crashes, and he's an extremely consistent pair of hands, and I think that's exactly what they need, especially when they've got a rookie like Zhou. Now, as I mentioned previously, he obviously had some extremely good points finishes at the start of the season when the car had quite a lot of pace, tailed off towards the end. Still think Bottas had a fairly strong season. Now, the 12th best driver this season for me was Carlos Sainz. Now, this might shock a few people, but yeah, he finished the season 5th, and looking at his quali results, he got beat 16-6 by Leclerc with an average quali position of 4.7. Now, if you consider that this Ferrari was arguably the quickest qualifying car for at least half the season, and it was still up there towards the end, to be honest. Getting beat by his teammate 16.6, arguably Leclerc is probably one of the best drivers on the grid, and he's an extremely good qualifier. And we know that Carlos Sainz is much better at sort of tyre management and in the racing. But with an average quality position of nearly 5, considering if that car was second best, you'd expect him to be finishing or qualifying at least 4th. 4th would be the worst out of the 2 Red Bulls and 2 Ferraris. But he's finishing on average 4.7th every race weekend. I just don't think he had that much strong of a season, to be honest. If you look at his race results, slightly better, but we know what Ferrari like with strategy. How many of those race results would Leclerc have beat him in if they didn't mess up the strategy? With an average race position of 3.5, that's actually fairly strong, to be honest, and he did get quite a lot of points. Not to mention the fact that he had an extremely large amount of DNFs. I think he had 6 DNFs across the season, so that's nearly a quarter of the races he DNF'd from. So I think if he didn't have that many issues, he would obviously finish a lot higher. But yeah, I still don't think he sort of had that strong of a season, considering in the car he had. I'm trying to make this sort of relative to the car. I think a lot of drivers on the grid could have done better in that Ferrari. So the 11th best driver for me was Kevin Magnussen. He finished the championship in 13th. Now looking at his quality results, he beats Schumacher 14.7 with an average quality position of 13.2. Looking at his races, he actually got beat by Schumacher 14.7, and he had an average race position of 13. Now I was quite surprised by this, considering he had double the amount of points as Schumacher at the end of the season, but as this Haas wasn't in the points for the majority of the races, I think Magnussen was kind of like on it or not, whereas Schumacher was sort of a lot more consistent with his finishing positions. But Kevin Magnussen managed to get that car into the points a lot more frequently than Mick Schumacher, and that is why he's got a seat next season. Not to mention the incredible pole in Interlagos, which I think everyone loved to see and was probably one of my moments of the season. I think Kevin Magnussen probably extracted like 80 to 90% of what that car was capable of across the season, compared to sort of Schumacher, maybe 40 to 50%. So I think that's why he's got that car next season. You can rely on him to get points. One thing I just think is his first lap instance, the amount of times he had to pit for a new front wing when he had a strong start to the race. I think he just needs to tone that down a bit. He's a little bit too eager. But yeah, excited to see him next season, and let's see what the Haas can do in 2023. Now, reaching the midway point of my rankings is Sergio Perez in 10th place. Now, he finished overall the championship in 3rd, missing out just to Leclerc in Abu Dhabi. And if we look at his qualifying against Verstappen, he got beat 5.17 with an average position of 4.8, and then if we look in the races, it was the same. He got beat 5.17 with an average race position of 4. Now I think it's difficult to compare Perez's season against Verstappen, because Verstappen is clearly the number 1 driver. He is operating on an absolute another level. I think he's sort of he's going to go down as all-time greats, and he's only won 2 championships already. Looking at Perez, I think he had sort of a bit of a hit and miss season. He obviously had the 2 race wins in Monaco and Singapore. I think the Monaco one was sort of a little bit dodgy. He probably shouldn't have won that, but Ferrari just didn't seem to nail their strategy. But I'm a bit split if it's what Red Bull want. Having Perez allowed Verstappen to easily win the championship, to easily win both championships, the constructors and the drivers. Yeah, I don't know if they'll want to keep him. They seem happy. I can't see them really going for anyone else, but maybe in 2024 they might go for like a Lando, but I just think that would cause upset within the team, as I think Lando or another driver, maybe Leclerc, if Ferrari dropped off, would be good enough to push Verstappen for a win. Sergio Perez, 10th. I think he had a solid season. Nothing remarkable. That Red Bull was extremely quick. But yeah, just a solid season from him. So crossing the halfway mark now, and in 9th place is Esteban Ocon, and these drivers are going to be who I think had an above average season. So finishing the overall championship in 8th place, going up against Alonso, one of the all-time greats in F1. He qualified 9 to 13, and then in the races he actually finished 13-9 against Alonso with an average position of 8.2. So he normally gains quite a few places in the races. Now, for the sort of first half of the season, I actually had Ocon down as one of my drivers, maybe top 3 drivers of the season. He was consistently finishing in like 6th, 7th place. He wasn't DNFing, he was getting points every race, and he was just extremely solid. I think the second half of the season we saw Alonso really step on. Obviously he got unlucky, and I'll mention that when I get to him. But I think when you compare Alonso versus Ocon, you can just see that Alonso has that another level that Ocon just doesn't really have. But I still think Ocon is an extremely good driver, and it's exactly what Alpine sort of need. Without him, they wouldn't be 4th in the Constructors. He had an extremely good season for them, and yeah, really solid season from Ocon. 8th place now, and I've got Alex Albon, which might seem strange finishing the season in 19th place, but that Williams was awful. Qualifying, he went 18-3 against Latifi, so absolutely dominated, with an average quality position of 17.5, and then in races he went 17-4 with an average race position of 15.8. So that car is clearly the worst car on the grid, and the reason I've got him in P8 is I don't think people understand the difficulty of getting the worst car on the grid into the points. It's like saying, going from like P18, P19 to 20 to points is like a jump of 8. It's like a McLaren or Aston getting a podium or something like that, or even a win. They're gaining that many positions. It's extremely hard. I think sometimes his drives go unnoticed. He's managed to actually qualify fairly strong in quite a few races as well. And I just don't think there's that much more he could have done in that car this season, to be honest. The only thing I'd say is I don't think Latifi is sort of the best comparison. It was similar to Russell last season. It was difficult to compare his season. We'll see next season with Albon up against Sargent. Again, it's going to be hard to tell because Sargent's a rookie. I think Albon has had an extremely underrated season. And yeah, solid drive from Albon. Sebastian Vettel next. In his final season in F1, I've got him as P7, finishing the championship in 12th place. Now going up against Stroll in qualifying, he beat him 13-7, and in the races it was 10-all. Now the difference between Vettel and Stroll is you can just see the quality similar to Alonso and Ocon. He can just operate on another level when he needs to. It's the difference between a really, really solid driver and a world champion. You can see in Abu Dhabi, his last race, that last quali lap was absolutely incredible, and he's just been getting solid points for the team. I would have loved to see him back at a top team to see what he could do, but yeah, sadly I don't think it's going to happen. But I think he can have his head held high in his final season in F1. In my opinion, he had an extremely solid season and yeah, a much better drive than his teammate Lance Stroll. Now, 6th on the list, I have Lewis Hamilton, and he finished the driver's standings in 6th place. Now, before any of you say this is too low, this is why I'm saying this is my rankings of this season only. If it was my driver rankings, Lewis Hamilton would be first. I think he's the best driver of all time on the grid currently, and arguably at the moment I'd say he's probably first or second best driver at the moment. But this season only, I think he had a slightly underwhelming season. When your teammate comes into a new team and gets pole position and wins, and you don't get either, I think Hamilton will be extremely disappointed with his performance this season, and I think he'll know there's a lot more to come. Now, the one thing that everyone's been saying is, yes, he sacrificed his car for performance to allow George Russell to get the most out of the car, and Hamilton was experimenting with parts and setups as he's the most experienced driver, and there's no point of Hamilton maximising the car if it's only the 3rd quickest. He'd rather be at the back experimenting with setups in order to get the car to where it is. And arguably Hamilton, probably with his development that he did earlier on in the season, got the car to arguably the quickest car at the end of the season. So I think Hamilton is to thank for that. But if you look sort of completely objectively at the season, I don't think you can say that Hamilton sort of sacrificing his season for development made it a better season for Hamilton. I still think Russell had a better season. He also got quite unlucky with some things, but he also completed 96% of all of his laps across the whole season in races, which is extremely high when you compare it to someone like Sainz, who only completed 80%. I know Hamilton has got the talent and the skill to be up there for wins next season if the car is there, and let's just hope he can be there next season. Now, the 5th best driver of the season for me was Fernando Alonso, finishing the championship in 9th place. Qualified 13-9 against Esteban Ocon with an average quality position of 9.4, and then finished the race 9-13, so flipped over against Ocon with an average race pace of 8.7. Now, just watching Alonso drive this season showed that he still has the talent, and I think he could be operating at the highest level he's ever operated at. I know he said that, but you can just see it in him. From a midfield car, he's putting that car in places that it shouldn't be. It's quite common to see him sat in sort of 5th, 6th place in Grand Prix. The reason he finished below Ocon in the Drivers' Championship was just due to reliability. I'll put the graphic up on the screen of all the issues he's had with the car this season, but the list just goes on and on. There's almost an issue in every race, and I think it's almost a bit of there's obviously a bit of a conspiracy behind this. It does seem a bit dodgy that he had all these issues and Ocon had zero reliability issues. We obviously know that he decided to leave the team mid-season, so don't know about the speculation about that, but it just something seems a bit off with that. But I'm really excited to see him at Aston next season, and speaking of race wins, I don't think they're going to win any races next season, but if that's a competitive car, I think that's going to be a recipe for success. I still think Alonso has all the talent to win more world championships. So the 4th best driver of the season for me was Charles Leclerc, finished the season 2nd. Now, he absolutely thrashed Sainz in qualifying 16.6, and in the races it was 13.9, so a little bit closer with pretty solid quality and race position of 3.3s. So I think his season was solid. We obviously know that the Ferrari strategy messed him up multiple times. There's so many races where he could have got a better finish, but he just got screwed on strategy, pit stops, things like that. So did Sainz, but Charles Leclerc specifically. But he also had sort of the quickest car at the start of the season, and we saw that with his 3 race wins, and he had 9 pole positions. So he obviously had a quick car that he could get pole on. We know that you can do that with a quick car, but maybe not a reliable car, which we saw in a lot of the races. That car just couldn't finish a lot of races. The races that they didn't mess up on strategy, the car would just set on fire, break down, things like that. Wasn't a great season, probably extremely frustrating. I think Leclerc could have pushed Verstappen a lot closer to the championship. I never think he could have beat him, but I think it should have been a lot more comfortable to him to get P2. But I put him as P4. There were a few mistakes, thinking back like Imola and Paul Ricard, that were definitely his fault, but still I think he is one of the quickest and best drivers on the grid. It was going to be interesting to see how quick that Ferrari is next season, because I really want to see him battling Verstappen like we saw in the first few races of the 2022 season. So we're getting into my top 3 now, and in 3rd place I've got Lando, finishing the drivers in 7th place. Now, if you consider that the Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes are on sort of another level above the rest of the grid, then it's almost like Lando Norris won the championship for the midfield. He's always in 7th place, extremely consistent. Just looking at his qualifying, he beat Ricciardo 19.3, and then in the races he also beat him 17.5. with an average quality position of 8.1 and an average race position of 7.8. So let's say that sort of the best that car is capable of 7th, he's almost getting that position every race, which is just incredible. Shows the consistency, the pace, and I just think he's one of the best drivers on the grid at the moment. I think next season's going to be interesting against Piastri. Is he going to absolutely dominate Piastri? Then we look at Lando as one of the best drivers on the grid that needs to be getting into a Ferrari or Mercedes or Red Bull. Or does it become a lot more level and they sort of share the points? Because if Ricciardo got the same amount of points as Norris this season, they'd be P4 comfortably. I think Lando got 80% of McLaren's points or something like that. It was a lot. So next season's going to be interesting. I think that will probably show where he really is in terms of talent-wise. But Lando is 3rd best driver of the 2022 season for me. So the runner-up, the 2nd best driver on the grid for me for the 2022 season was George Russell, finishing the championship in 4th place. Now in qualifying he went 10-12 against Hamilton with an average position of 5.5, and then in the races he went 12-10 beating Hamilton with an average quality position of 4.4. Say what you want about the Mercedes and Hamilton experimenting, George Russell in his first season in a team going up against 7-time world champion, arguably the best driver on the grid, and beating him, I think is something that should be spoken about more. Yes, we know that Hamilton had probably was experimenting with car setups in the first half of the season, but George Russell actually scored more points than Hamilton in the first 11 races and the second 11 races. So it's not like it was sort of a landslide in the first half and then Hamilton thrashed him in the second. It was fairly consistent actually across the season, and he got a pole position in that Mercedes and also got a race win and a sprint win. Hamilton didn't get any of those. I think Russell had an extremely good season. He has so much potential, and yeah, for me he was the second best driver of the season. No surprises here. Max Verstappen in P1 finished the season first, 2-time champion back to back, beat Perez in qualifying 17.5 with an average quality position of 3.4. In the races he also went 17.5 with an average race position of 2.8. Now we know what Verstappen's like. He won the most races in an F1 season ever. When he had a car that hadn't had damage and the strategy was fine, he was winning every race. Absolutely dominated this season on another level to everyone else, including Russell, Leclerc, Hamilton, Norris for me. And I think it's a bit scary seeing Verstappen this strong. It's going to be a big struggle to try stop him next season, especially if that Red Bull is competitive, because I can't see anyone doing it, to be honest. So that's my 2022 season driver rankings. Let me know in the comments below if you agree or disagree with these. If you've made it to the end of the video as well, thank you so much for watching, and if you consider liking and subscribing, it really helps to make the channel grow. So stick around, I'm going to be doing my 2022 race rankings. I'll probably do a tier list ranking the races from best to worst, but yeah, that'll probably be out next week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.